It started as a respectful discussion, but one sentence turned it into a viral showdown. What Jasmine Crockett said next didn't just silence the courtroom, it shook the internet. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, the entire courtroom went still. It wasn't the usual courtroom silence. It was the kind that feels alive, the kind that vibrates in the air like the echo of thunder after a storm. Every camera froze mid-pan. Every reporter stopped typing mid-sentence. Even the soft whir of the ceiling fans seemed to fade away, as if the air itself refused to move until someone dared to break the tension. And at the center of that silence stood Jasmine, confident, composed, and utterly unshaken. Across the polished oak bench sat Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the most respected and influential judges in American history. Her presence carried the weight of decades, decades of rulings, of battles for equality, of standing firm when others bent under pressure. That afternoon, however, there was something different in the room, something invisible but powerful. Moments earlier, Jasmine had said something that pierced through the usual political chatter and landed straight in the heart of every listener. Her voice had been steady, her eyes locked on the bench as she declared, "Justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the people brave enough to demand it." It was a sentence that seemed to slice through the air like a blade, sharp, direct, and impossible to ignore. And that's when it happened. Justice Ginsburg, leaning slightly forward, adjusted her glasses and spoke, her tone calm, deliberate, yet carrying that unmistakable authority that could silence a room without effort. "Miss Crockett," she said, "that's a passionate statement, but passion without principle is dangerous." The sound of her words lingered, echoing against the marble walls. A gasp rippled through the courtroom audience. A few reporters exchanged quick glances, already sensing this was no ordinary exchange. This was history in real time. For a moment, Jasmine didn't move. Her expression didn't falter. She stood there, every bit the composed leader she was known to be. People whispered quietly in the back rows, not because of disrespect, but because everyone could feel something monumental was unfolding. This wasn't a clash of egos. It was a clash of eras, experience versus conviction, tradition versus transformation. Justice Ginsburg represented the legacy, the long, disciplined fight for equality and justice, carved through years of persistence. Jasmine represented the future, unafraid, unfiltered, and unwilling to accept the way things have always been as an excuse for stagnation. The contrast was electric. A few cameras zoomed in close, catching every subtle flicker of expression, the measured calm in Ruth's eyes, the quiet determination in Jasmine's stance. Some in the audience expected Jasmine to apologize, to soften her tone, to say something like, "You're right, Your Honor." But those who knew her, who had watched her in countless debates and interviews, knew better. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't built to shrink in moments of pressure. She was built to rise. As the silence stretched on, you could almost hear people's thoughts. Would she respond? Would she hold her ground? And then came that subtle shift, the smallest movement that changed everything. Jasmine straightened her posture, took a calm breath, and glanced briefly at the audience before turning her gaze back to the bench. Her eyes, bright and unwavering, locked with Justice Ginsburg. You could see the mutual respect, but also the tension of two powerful minds testing the boundaries of one another. The reporters' fingers hovered above their keyboards, ready to capture whatever came next. The cameras zoomed in tighter, their lenses practically trembling with anticipation. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Seconds ticked by. 1, 2, 3. It was as if the entire room was suspended in time, waiting for her next move. And in that stillness, even Justice Ginsburg seemed to study her, waiting not for defiance, but depth. Because that's what this was, not a scolding, not a debate, but a test of conviction. Would Jasmine prove that her passion had substance behind it, or would she fold under the pressure of one of the greatest legal minds in history? Everyone leaned forward, breath held, eyes fixed. And then, just as the silence began to feel unbearable, Jasmine's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Not a smirk, not arrogance, just the kind of quiet, knowing smile that said, "I'm not afraid to answer that." That was the moment everyone in the room realized. Whatever she said next was going to be unforgettable. The tension didn't just hang in the room, it owned the room. Because what was about to unfold wasn't just an argument. It was a dialogue between generations, between the past that built the foundation and the future determined to rebuild the walls. And as Jasmine finally opened her mouth to speak, the courtroom braced itself. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness one of the most powerful exchanges ever captured on camera. To understand why that moment shook the entire courtroom, you have to understand who these two women really were. This wasn't just a meeting between a congresswoman and a judge. It was a collision between two eras of power. On one side sat Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a name that carried more weight than most entire institutions. She was the living definition of perseverance, the woman who turned impossible into done. A pioneer who didn't just argue for equality, she rewrote the laws that made it possible. Her voice, calm, intellectual, unwavering, had guided generations. When she spoke, even her critics listened. Because Ruth didn't raise her voice, she raised her reasoning. Every word she spoke came sharpened by experience and forged by years of standing against silence. To the public, she was the notorious RBG. But inside that courtroom, she was something far greater. A symbol of how far conviction can carry a single voice. And then, on the other side of that courtroom, stood Jasmine Crockett, young, bold, and unafraid of friction. Where Ruth's power came from precision, Jasmine's came from passion. She was the new wave, fearless in debate, unapologetic in tone, and driven by a fire that couldn't be contained by convention. Her rise wasn't handed to her, it was earned, every inch of it. Born into a world that still doubted women who spoke too loudly, Jasmine turned that doubt into drive. She built her reputation not by pleasing everyone, but by challenging everyone. Politicians, media, and systems that treated fairness like an option instead of a duty. To her supporters, she represented the voice of a generation tired of waiting. To her critics, she was too much, too direct, too emotional, too real. But to those who really understood her, Jasmine Crockett wasn't too much. She was exactly enough for a time that needed courage more than comfort. That day, the stage was unlike any other. A special judicial forum on truth and transparency in government, a rare event where leaders, lawmakers, and legal giants gathered to discuss how justice could adapt in a changing world. Every major network was streaming it live. Cameras lined the walls like soldiers, every angle covered, every word recorded. You could feel that this wasn't going to be just another polite discussion. This was a battlefield of ideas, and everyone in that room knew it. When Jasmine was invited to speak, she walked up to the podium with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the weight of her own words. She wasn't there to perform, she was there to speak truth. Her voice carried effortlessly across the courtroom, calm yet full of conviction. She spoke about accountability, about the moral duty of leadership, and about how justice must never bend to convenience. And as her words filled the air, the audience, reporters, attorneys, and students leaned in closer. Then came the line that started everything. "Justice doesn't belong to the powerful," she said. "It belongs to the people brave enough to demand it." The sentence hit like a spark in dry air. You could see it on faces, some inspired, some unsettled. And it was in that moment that Justice Ginsburg leaned forward. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't interrupt. She simply looked at Jasmine, the way a teacher looks at a student who reminds her of herself, but without the restraint time had taught her. Then, calmly but firmly, she said, "Miss Crockett, that's a passionate statement, but passion without principle is dangerous." The air changed instantly. It wasn't hostility, it was history repeating itself. The old guard and the new generation, both believing in justice, both fighting for truth, but from two completely different worlds. The reporters exchanged glances. They knew this wasn't going to be a normal exchange of words. This was going to be something raw, something real, something unforgettable. Even the sound engineers in the back had stopped adjusting their mics. Every camera zoomed in. Every viewer at home leaned closer to their screens. Because when two forces like this collide, you don't just watch, you feel it. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about power. It was about two women who in their own ways had fought the same fight, the fight for fairness, but carried different tools to win it. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's weapon was patience and precision. Jasmine Crockett's was courage and confrontation. And in that courtroom, for the first time, those two worlds met head-on. The past and the future. Principle and passion. Experience and energy. No shouting, no insults, just the undeniable tension of two brilliant minds, both right in their own way, both unwilling to yield. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of judgment anymore. It felt like the heart of democracy itself, beating loud, alive, and unafraid. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not a blink, not a tremor. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, waiting to see if she'd break under the weight of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's challenge. But she didn't. She took a slow breath, the kind that steadies you before stepping into history. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands, resting on the podium, didn't shake. And when she spoke, her voice carried that rare balance, calm enough to demand attention, strong enough to hold it. "With all due respect, Justice Ginsburg," she began, "principle is what fuels passion. Without it, people stay silent. And silence," she paused deliberately, "is the comfort zone of injustice." For a heartbeat, there was only the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then, a low murmur rippled through the audience. Some gasped softly, others whispered to one another. The statement landed like a spark, not explosive, but powerful enough to light a flame that couldn't be ignored. You could see it in her eyes. Jasmine wasn't defying the judge. She was defending the idea of voice itself. She wasn't there to win an argument. She was there to speak truth, no matter how uncomfortable it sounded. As she continued, her tone deepened. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a confession, a call, a reminder. "I grew up in communities," she said, "where justice was something people whispered about, like a dream, distant and unreachable. We were told that fairness was for the few who could afford it, that power was a wall we'd never climb." A few people in the audience nodded, connecting with every word. She went on, her voice rising ever so slightly, steady, intentional. "But I stand here today because women like you taught us that we don't wait for the system to care. We make it care." There it was, the bridge between generations. The young leader honoring the legacy of the giant before her, while boldly pushing that legacy forward. Justice Ginsburg didn't move. Her chin rested gently against her hand, eyes locked on Jasmine, not with disapproval, but with the focused attention of a mentor watching someone discover their own power. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply listened. And that silence from the bench spoke louder than any ruling. It said, "Go on." Jasmine took that unspoken permission and breathed deeper. Her next words came softer, almost like poetry, but with the precision of truth cutting through marble. "You once said that real change happens one step at a time, but sometimes, Your Honor, those steps have to be louder. Because if fighting for equality looks like rebellion—" She let the line hang in the air for a moment, every pair of eyes on her, every heart waiting for the next beat. Then, maybe we've misunderstood what obedience really means. That sentence didn't just hit the room, it stopped it. No papers rustled, no phones clicked. Even the stenographer who had been typing nonstop froze mid-sentence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, it was pure, distilled truth. And in that truth, something shifted, invisible but undeniable. It wasn't Jasmine versus Ruth anymore. It was Jasmine and Ruth, two voices echoing through different decades, both fighting the same battle with different weapons. You could see the realization sweep across the faces of everyone watching. Some looked humbled, others inspired. One young woman sitting in the back quietly wiped away a tear. Because what Jasmine had just said wasn't a political soundbite. It was a challenge, not just to the system, but to the mindset that told people to wait their turn. She stood there, silent now, her last words still hanging like smoke in the air. For a full 10 seconds, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Then, Justice Ginsburg slowly leaned back in her chair. Her expression was unreadable, eyes thoughtful, lips pressed together in quiet reflection. That pause, that sacred silence, was more powerful than any applause. It was respect. It was recognition. Reporters would later write that in those few moments, the air inside that courtroom felt different, lighter somehow, freer. Because what had just happened wasn't a clash of ideology. It was the passing of a torch. A younger woman had looked a legend in the eye, not to challenge her authority, but to remind the world that her legacy was alive, breathing, and still growing. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the woman who had spent her entire life fighting to give others a voice, had just witnessed her work continue. Not in law books, but in living flesh. That's why the room stayed silent, not because they were shocked, but because they were moved. And as the camera zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett's face, that same calm, unwavering look told the entire world what words could not. She didn't come to argue. She came to evolve the conversation. For nearly 10 seconds, no one said a word. Not the reporters, not the camera operators, not even the bailiff by the door who usually coughed every few minutes. The courtroom, a place that usually buzzed with whispers, movement, and the quiet hum of tension, was completely still. It was as if the entire room collectively realized they had just witnessed something far greater than a debate. This wasn't politics. This wasn't performance. It was truth, raw and alive, standing in the middle of that courtroom in the form of two women who defined courage in different ways. Then, slowly, very slowly, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that cameras could exaggerate or headlines could twist. It was small, genuine, filled with something rare: pride. She adjusted her glasses slightly, leaned forward, and said in a voice that carried both authority and warmth, "Miss Crockett," she began, "you remind me of why I never retired early. It's because voices like yours are proof that the work isn't finished. It's evolving." The crowd let out a collective breath. Some smiled, some blinked back tears. Because in that single sentence, the distance between generations disappeared. It was no longer about experience versus energy. It was about continuity, the passing of a torch from a trailblazer who had paved the road to a fighter now walking it with fearless conviction. Reporters began scribbling furiously, trying to capture every word, every expression. Photographers adjusted their lenses, desperate to freeze that exact moment, the one where wisdom met fire and neither backed down. The air was electric but soft, like the final note of a powerful song that lingers long after the music stops. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond right away. Her eyes glistened for just a second, though she didn't let a single tear fall. Instead, she gave a slow nod, a gesture that said everything words could not. It was respect. It was gratitude. And it was acknowledgement that the fight for justice was not a competition. It was a relay. "Thank you, Justice Ginsburg," Jasmine finally said, her voice calm yet heavy with meaning. "I hope I can honor what you built and help others build beyond it." Ruth's smile deepened, faint but full of approval. "You already are," she replied quietly. Those words landed softer than a whisper, but stronger than any speech. Then came the sound, not a roar, not a standing ovation, but the kind of slow, reverent applause that begins in one corner and spreads like a wave of understanding. Not loud, not flashy, just respectful. The kind of applause people give when they know they've just witnessed history. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the subtle power of that shared moment. Two women, from different eras, different battles, different styles, but the same purpose. In that instant, it didn't matter who was right or wrong. It didn't matter whose words were stronger. What mattered was that the message, equality, justice, and the courage to speak truth had transcended time itself. It was almost poetic. One woman, the architect of progress, the other, its fearless inheritor, both standing together in the same frame, a symbol of everything that had been fought for and everything still worth fighting for. Outside, news outlets were already buzzing. Social media feeds began to explode. Clips of that exchange, Ruth's calm wisdom, Jasmine's fearless reply, and that shared smile, flooded timelines across the world. People captioned it with words like, "History meets the future." 2 generations, 1 mission. The torch has been passed. But inside the courtroom, none of that mattered. What stayed in people's hearts wasn't the quote or the clip, it was the feeling. The feeling of witnessing integrity in its purest form. The feeling of realizing that justice isn't owned by anyone. It's shared, protected, and carried forward by those brave enough to keep speaking when silence would be easier. As the session adjourned, Ruth Bader Ginsburg stood up slowly, gathering her papers. Before leaving the bench, she turned to Jasmine one last time and said softly, just loud enough for her to hear, "Keep shaking the room, Miss Crockett. That's how change echoes." Jasmine smiled, almost in disbelief, and responded, "I learned from the best." And with that, the courtroom emptied, but the moment stayed. Even hours later, people in the hallways still spoke in hushed tones about what they'd seen. It wasn't just a dialogue, it was a passing of destiny. Because sometimes history doesn't announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a courtroom, between 2 voices that refuse to let the truth die in silence. That day, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Jasmine Crockett reminded the world that justice doesn't belong to one age, one race, or one ideology. It belongs to everyone, brave enough to carry it forward one honest conversation at a time. And that's why, even after the camera stopped rolling, the echo of that exchange continued to live on, not just in headlines, but in hearts. Within hours, clips of their exchange spread across the internet like wildfire. The headline appeared everywhere, from breaking news banners to trending hashtags. Justice Ginsburg challenges Jasmine Crockett, But her reply freezes the room. The clip exploded across every corner of social media. On TikTok, creators stitched it with reactions. On YouTube, political commentators analyzed every word. On Instagram, young activists shared it with captions that read, "This is what grace under pressure looks like." Within just 12 hours, the moment had crossed borders. It was being translated, reposted, and discussed in classrooms, courtrooms, and cafes around the world. People weren't just watching, they were feeling it. Some praised Jasmine Crockett for her composure, how she stood her ground without ever raising her voice, proving that confidence doesn't have to come from volume. Others admired Justice Ginsburg for something even rarer, humility, the willingness to listen even when being challenged by someone decades younger. Commentators called it a conversation between eras. Podcasts dissected it, late-night hosts joked about it with reverence, and professors played it in ethics classes. It wasn't just political, it was personal, because everyone, regardless of age or belief, could see themselves in that moment. One person holding fast to tradition, another pushing toward progress, both meeting halfway, not as enemies, but as equals. One viral comment summed it up best. It wasn't an argument, it was a handoff. And that's exactly what it felt like. It wasn't a clash of egos or a battle for dominance. It was a handoff between two generations of women who refused to let fear define their role in history. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had built the foundation, brick by brick, ruling by ruling. And Jasmine Crockett, fiery and unafraid, was now walking the path Ruth had paved, carrying the torch forward into a world still learning what equality truly means. By the next morning, news outlets across the country had turned that single exchange into front-page headlines. Two titans of justice, when principle met passion. Jasmine Crockett's calm reply goes down in history. RBG's final lesson, and the voice that answered it. Even political commentators who rarely agreed found common ground in admiration. One conservative writer said, "I may not share Jasmine's politics, but I can't deny her poise. That's leadership." While a progressive blogger wrote, "Ginsburg showed us how true wisdom doesn't silence the young, it guides them." For a brief moment, the endless noise of division seemed to quiet down, replaced by something rare, mutual respect. When Jasmine Crockett finally stepped out of the courthouse later that day, flashing lights and microphones surrounded her. Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't rush. She paused, looked calm, and gave a small, thoughtful smile. One reporter managed to ask, "What was it like to go toe-to-toe with Justice Ginsburg?" Jasmine thought for a moment, and then delivered a line that instantly became legend. "It wasn't a fight," she said softly. "It was a lesson." She reminded me that courage without wisdom is noise, and I hope I reminded her that wisdom without courage can be silence. That one quote echoed across the world. It was replayed on news shows, printed on posters, and spoken on graduation stages. People wrote it under posts about leadership, about courage, about women empowering women. Within hours, it had become more than a quote. It had become a movement. In the following weeks, that courtroom exchange became a case study in leadership, communication, and respect. Professors analyzed it in universities. Motivational speakers referenced it in their talks. And social media users turned it into a symbol of what our world desperately needed: dialogue over dominance, empathy over ego. Even months later, clips of that day continue to resurface. Every time they did, people were reminded that the power of truth isn't in who shouts it the loudest, it's in who delivers it with integrity. And so, what began as a moment of disagreement became something timeless, a bridge between generations built not with anger, but with understanding. Justice Ginsburg had shown the world that true wisdom listens. Jasmine Crockett had shown the world that true courage speaks. And together, they reminded everyone watching that justice isn't static. It grows. It evolves through voices willing to challenge, learn, and pass the torch forward. As one viral comment said best, "That wasn't a courtroom moment. That was history shaking hands with the future." And in that handshake, in that silence, that respect, that exchange, the world saw a glimpse of what real progress looks like. Not one generation replacing another, but both standing side by side, proving that when passion meets principle, the world moves forward.